G'day folks, and welcome to this second video in a series on GTS tactics. In this video I'm talking about indirect fire and the implications of this fire, not only in terms of the damage it can potentially do to your enemy, but in terms of how it can facilitate grand tactical planning and disrupt your enemy's plans. The units I'm talking about here in particular are mortar units, indirect HE, emplaced artillery and organic artillery, those units that can place those barrage markers. And quickly coming to the belief that these are some of the most important units in the game. They all tend to have relatively low firepower, but they have very important, critical tactical possibilities. Now, when firing against armoured units, there are quite a few possible suppression results, so they're not highly effective against those armoured units. Nonetheless, they can be important for targeting those armoured units in terms of denying them long-range sight. This is particularly important if those armoured units are of course ranged, have high firepowers and are trying to attack your units. Now of course you're more likely to do damage against unarmoured units, and there's quite a lot of good suppression, cohesion hits and elimination results on the combat results table when targeting those unarmoured units. But perhaps most importantly is the placement of barrage markers on those targets. I talk about how these barrage markers blind enemy units. It reduces their fire range to just 1 hex. Those barrage markers also serve as blocking terrain for line of sight. There are other considerations as well. So there's a troop quality reduction for units under those markers. It's -1 for light barrage, -2 for heavy barrage. There's a firepower reduction, again -1 for light, -2 for heavy. There are movement penalties. This is really important in my experience. It costs extra movement points to move through light. A unit trying to move out of a heavy barrage marker has to pass a troop quality check to move and will suffer a cohesion hit regardless of whether they pass or fail. In fact, so important are these indirect fire units that they're typically worth spending command points on to enable them to fire early in a turn. That's regardless of whether the chit is a direct activation, keeping in mind that only non-independent units can be activated here, or a divisional activation. And of course they can fire for free on their first action with the formation activation. And so important is that first chit drawn in a turn, and the potential to be the first player to place those barrage markers. That the first chit draw in a turn almost always feel like the most important one, primarily for that potential to place barrage markers with these units. If you've watched my playthrough of the Saga of the 6th Airborne, for example, Camp Groups were regularly prevented turn after turn after turn, it seemed, from making attacks on the Allied positions due to the Allies really seizing that initiative via a lucky early chit draw. That early Allied indirect fire typically occurred first in these turns, thus forcing the Germans to spend their command points to manoeuvre around these barrage markers and fire. The Allies had more formations. They had the commandos, several different formations, while the Germans typically just had the one formation activation. So placing barrage markers on important enemy units can often force the enemy to basically they have to move out of that barrage marker and then spend a command point for a second action if they want to fire. If the barrage is heavy, they could be stuck there if they fail their troop quality check, and of course they would suffer a cohesion hit regardless. So prioritizing indirect fire is important and becomes particularly powerful when you have command point superiority over your opponent. Typically, if you have that superiority, you'll have more command points and you'll have no problem spending those points to fire with your units. And by firing first, as I just mentioned, you'll often force your opponent to spend their inferior CP to maneuver around the barrage and fire if they're on the attack. So don't underestimate the importance of barraging early. It can also be important to barrage empty spaces to, in effect, place smoke and block line of sight. Effective smoke placement can block the potential line of sight of several enemy units at once. So in this situation, for example, if the Germans can place just 2 barrage markers in those hexes, they block about the line of sight of about half a dozen of those Allied ranged units to the left of those barraged hexes. So instead of targeting just 2 enemy units, they can target sort of units close to friendlies, which either forces the enemy to get close to adjacent range, or basically to try to move around or wait until a subsequent turn. There are other considerations here as well. So indirect fire and the placement of those barrage markers is good preparation for an assault in terms of reducing the target troop quality and firepower. There's also the potential for suppression, of course, all the more likely if the unit is unarmoured. And finally, indirect fire can help protect your units prior to rallying. By blocking enemy fields of fire, your units may suddenly find themselves able to rally and recover from cohesion hits because they can't be seen by the enemy. And because of all these considerations, you can set up good defensive areas to make most effective use of defensive indirect fire. And the Allied defences of Coburg in the Saga of the 6th Airborne is again another example of how this can take place. By holding just a thin line 3-4 hexes wide, forcing the Germans to push through that gap, they could, the Allies could more easily place just a small number of barrage markers to blind the entire German front. This prevented their ranged units from attacking, and it forced the Germans to make some difficult decisions, either move into the open, where they're often killed, or stop and wait till a subsequent turn. Good defensive positions with indirect fire in mind can also be supported by careful placement of AT guns. By putting your guns sort of, by not stacking these together, spreading them out with overlapping fields of fire, your enemy, you can force your enemy to make difficult decisions regarding moving around your barrage markers and avoiding the fields of fire of those AT guns. So thinking about all this, how do you counter indirect fire, particularly where the enemy has more guns and perhaps more command points? Well, again, I think the German strategy in the Saga of the 6th Airborne was a good one. They were just facing an enemy in a superior position. They tried to attack across broad rather than narrow fronts, and when they were broad in their attack, they were more successful. They could more easily navigate barrage markers, find clear lines of sight to the target. It makes it more difficult for your opponent to blind every single one of your units. You need to avoid, of course, stacking your ranged units, keep them well spread out, and consider, I guess, some flexibility in your approach. I made a mistake in the Saga of the 6th by just focusing on one enemy unit, just focusing on one area at a time, and it made it easy for the Allies to blind the Germans attacking that position. Conversely, if they're attacking across a broad area, they can usually find some clear lines of sight and pick targets that are available, thus saving themselves time and resources. Now, having said all of this, nothing can save you from a bad chit draw, or of course from rolling a 9, which won't place a barrage marker. If you're the last to draw your formation activation and your enemy has already placed all their barrage markers, blinding all your units, you'll often be forced to either accept the situation and wait for a future turn, unless you're really pressed for time. It's often just best to conserve your CP rather than wasting them on 1 or 2 weak attacks that the enemy is likely to just rally and recover from. So for all these reasons, as I said, I think units that can create indirect fire and place these barrage markers are core to your tactical considerations on the offensive and the defensive. They can certainly make the difference between an easy attack and a very difficult one.